All right, welcome Ranger Kelly. We have a great class here, fourth graders from Bedell, and we're ready for you.
Fantastic! Well, welcome everybody to this special broadcast of Channel Islands Live. My name, as Ranger Monique said, is Ranger Kelly, or Kelly Moore, and I am a park ranger here at Channel Islands National Park. And today is a very, 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 very special day for us. We are joining 411 other national parks in celebrating 100 years of protecting and sharing our nation's most precious treasures, the national parks. And we are so excited that you've joined us on this very special day. And I'd like to start by welcoming our audiences. We've got a small group here with us on Anacapa Island. I just saw right before I jumped in the water. So welcome everyone topside here on Anacapa. We also have a great group of fourth graders from Santa Paula. They're at our visitor center. Hey, fourth graders, can I get a great big hello, Ranger Kelly, on three? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Oh, that was very loud. It sounds like you're almost right here with me, underwater at the Channel Islands. So good, you guys can hear me, I can hear you. And today we are diving in the portion of the park most visitors don't get to see. It's literally a forest underwater. All right, fourth graders, if you know the name of this forest, please shout it out. Go! You got it! All right, I'm definitely going to have to make my questions more difficult for you next time. You're right, Kelp Forest, and it's home to nearly 1,000 different marine organisms. And this is a very special kelp forest because we are diving in what we call a marine reserve. And in these areas, there's no fishing or taking of any wildlife at all. It's protected. Everything around me today is protected. And so what you get to witness, what we all get to witness, is a very healthy, functioning ecosystem. So, in today's program, we will take a closer look at some of the different animals that call the kelp forest home. We'll touch on some current threats to this kelp forest ecosystem and ways that you and I can help protect it. All right, are you ready? Let's begin by first taking a closer look at the main seaweed or algae of the kelp forest, giant kelp itself. And here's a great example of what a kelp plant looks like. And it's very well adapted for living in this marine environment. It's got these flexible or bendable, they look a lot like stems, but they're called stipes. And they allow the kelp to move around because the ocean is always moving. And that helps them survive. They've also got a very important part here. My cameraman Josh will zoom in for you. Hopefully you'll get a good up-close and personal shot of what we call an air-filled bladder. This air-filled bladder, surprise, is filled with air. And it acts like a big balloon, lifting the kelp up towards the surface of the ocean because it needs something that is shining down from up above to survive. Fourth graders, maybe this is too easy, but shout it out. What's shining down from up above that the kelp needs to survive? You guys are so great. Yeah, the sun. And it uses that sun familiar with that term. Photosynthesis is this process that helps produce energy for kelp to grow. And kelp is one of the fastest growing organisms on the planet. All right, fourth graders, does anybody want to take a guess? How tall can kelp grow in just one day? Ranger Money, do you have any takers?
Like 3 inches?
3 inches is a great guess, but kelp can grow a bit faster. I will take one more guess.
20 feet?
Can you repeat that, please?
20 feet?
Whoa! 20 feet is also a great guess. The correct answer is, drum roll, 2 feet. So 2 feet is about this tall. Okay, 24 inches. Imagine if you grew 2 feet in one day. You'd be halfway to the moon. Well, kelp is very well adapted for living in this marine environment. With that process of photosynthesis, kelp is also producing oxygen for everything that lives here under the sea, but it also produces the majority of the oxygen that you and I breathe every day. So join me now. Take a big, deep breath. And thank your nearest kelp plant for that oxygen you just got. Okay, let's move on to something a little more exciting. Let's move on to some critters that call the kelp forest home. You ready? Once you know the name of this critter, my dive buddies are going to bring one in. If you guys see it and you know the name of it, shout it out, okay? Come on in. I'll reel you in like a big fish. There they are. Thank you, Ranger Jeff. All right, what are these critters, guys? Urchins, you got it. Sea urchins. I've got a red sea urchin here and a purple sea urchin here. 2 different species that both live in the kelp forest and rely on it for food. In particular, you can see as kelp blades, they call it, look a lot like leaves, but they're called blades. They often break off and float down to the seafloor, and urchins have adapted these great spines that then pierce the kelp, moving it, I dropped my purple, oh, we'll leave them there for now, moving that kelp blade down into the under part of its body where its mouth is. So you're getting a good shot of that. So they're really good at eating kelp, and that's their primary food source here, are the different types of algae you see around me. And believe it or not, a lot of people eat sea urchin. Maybe you guys are going, really? People eat sea urchin? Well, believe it or not, there's a type of sushi called uni that comes from this type of sea urchin right here, the red sea urchin. Purples are usually too small, so people don't eat them as often. But in a lot of areas here at the Channel Islands, fishermen collect sea urchin to sell as uni in mostly Asian markets, but you can find it here locally as well at your local sushi restaurant. So oftentimes we don't see as many red urchins because they've all been removed from areas that are not protected like this marine reserve. And what happens is the purple urchins really luck out because they've got no more competition from our red sea urchins. And their populations can explode. They can mow down entire kelp forests, especially if we also remove the animals that eat our purple urchins, like lobster or giant California sheephead. So in areas that are not protected, we see a lot of purple urchins, and often areas where there's very little kelp. It's a good example of why it's important to have areas like these marine reserves that keep everything in balance and all the players of the food web present to help maintain that balance. no predators get to them. Oh, and as he takes those urchins, he handed me another kelp forest critter. Hey, you guys, if you know what this is, go ahead and shout it out, fourth graders.
Sea cucumber.
My goodness, you guys are so sharp. You're right. It is called a warty sea cucumber, and you can imagine why it got that name. It's got little warts or bumps all over its body. But this is a cousin to the sea urchin you just saw. And it spends most of its time crawling around on the seafloor. It really likes sandy bottoms because it goes around and eats all the plant and animal matter that kind of falls to the sea, a lot like an earthworm in the soils on land. And sea cucumbers like this are also collected and eaten in many markets, especially in Asia. You might be able to find sea cucumber on a menu or at the local seafood shop. And so they're another example of one of the different kelp forest species or critters that really rely on the protection and refuge of these marine reserves. So I'm going to go ahead and put this guy back. You see, it really blends in well to the bottom. As I put it down, you can see how well it camouflages to the seafloor. Now, Ranger Monique, before I move on to another critter, I would love to take a question from our fourth grader class.
From all the fishes you've seen down in the marine reserve, what was the biggest species you've seen so far?
I really like that question. Well, just today, actually, I saw one of the biggest fish I've ever seen. On my dive earlier this morning, I saw what we call a giant black sea bass. Giant black sea bass can get to the size of Beetles, Volkswagen Beetle cars, several hundred pounds. Now, the one I saw wasn't that big. It was probably about 5 to 6 feet long, but that's still longer than I am tall. And it swam right by me, checked me out, and just kept on going. And my heart was thumping. Quite a spectacular thing to see. And one of the biggest fishes that we would see here in the kelp forest. Great question. Thank you so much. All right, you ready to see another critter? Let's bring them over. Oh, great. One of my favorite of the kelp forest. All right, everybody. Shout it out if you know the name of this animal. It got a little quiet on that end. This is what we call a sea hare. Hare like a rabbit. And you might guess why they call it a sea hare. Look at on its head. It's got these two big ears, much like a rabbit does. And this is a bit of a small one. They can get about 3 times as big, weighing almost 30 pounds. Okay, and this sea hare will graze around on algae, and we often see them halfway up the kelp plants. They will crawl up the blades and the stipes to get up to where they find the younger kelp blades because they're easier to chew, and those younger blades are typically at the top of kelp plants. So this one, it's actually one of my favorite critters to see in the kelp forest. Just because they're so soft and they're really neat to see. A really important player in the food web down here, too. All right, I'm going to go ahead and give our sea hare back because we've got so many critters to show you. I got to keep them coming. Here's one more for you. Oh, we've got a couple of good ones around here. Thank you, Ranger Dave. Okay, maybe you guys know the name of this critter. Go ahead and shout it out for critters. You knew I was going to ask you to shout it out, didn't you? This is called the California spiny lobster. Maybe you guys have seen some lobster before and are going, hey, where are the lobster's claws? Well, the California spiny lobster actually doesn't have claws. It's different than those species that occur often on the east coast of our country. Those Maine lobsters have big claws, which people eat. People do eat California spiny lobster as well, but instead of eating the claws, they just eat the tail portion here. So they are fished here at the Channel Islands, and it's an example of another species that really finds protection here in the Marine Reserve. And if I put it down, you'll see how well it too camouflages to the seafloor. And do I see any predators around? Yes, I do. Well, I was going to let it go, and you could watch it swim away, but if there's a big sheephead swimming around, I don't feel comfortable doing that, so I'm going to go ahead and give him back. Oh, wow, to my dive buddy who surprised me with another kelp forest critter. One of the top in the food chain. Thank you. Okay. What everybody always asks about, what kind of animal is this? I almost gave it away. Yeah, it's a shark. Everybody wants to know, do you see sharks, Ranger Kelly? Are you scared of sharks, Ranger Kelly? So here is a great example of one. And as you can see, there's really nothing to be afraid of. This horned shark is only about 2 feet long. This is what we typically see here at the Channel Islands, although there's about 16 other types of sharks that we could see if we were lucky. And sharks are a very important part of the food web here at the Channel Islands and around the world. And this individual usually is tucked back in cracks during the day. And they come out at nighttime to feed on small invertebrates like sea urchins and clams and crabs. So it's probably not too pleased that we've kept it awake during the day for today's program, but we promised it we would return it to the crack so it could continue its nap and rest up to feed tonight. So I'll go ahead and give it back now. Actually, I'm going to let it swim away and let you guys watch it swim, okay? And we'll see which way it goes, and this is a real test or challenge for my camera operator, Ranger Josh, to catch it as it swims away. Oh, well, hello! It missed me. It swam right back to me. Bye, horned shark. Okay, fourth graders, do you have another quick question for me before we move on?
How many sharks do you see, like, many sharks underwater?
Unfortunately, I don't get to see very many sharks underwater. I see a few a dive, like that size, a small horn shark or a swell shark. But I don't get to see too many anymore. Unfortunately, shark populations around the world are very threatened. And people kill sharks because they're afraid of them or because they like to eat them in a dish called shark fin soup. Maybe many of you have heard of that before. And so sharks are killed around the world at staggering rates. So unfortunately, we don't get to see too many, but they are a real treat when we do, and they're really an important part of the food web. We would like to see more of them because they keep other species in check, okay, and help keep everything balanced. So quickly, before we wrap up, I wanted to mention that even though we get to see this beautiful kelp forest today, boy, and all these critters we've gotten to see, and you can imagine how they all work in balance or in harmony here to keep this area healthy. But there are some threats to the kelp forest and our oceans as a whole. Do any of you fourth graders have any ideas about some of the current threats to our oceans?
people leave a lot of trash around, so the fishes eat that and they get poisoned?
Very good, yes. Excellent answer. Excellent. Yeah, trash is a big threat. Pollution, plastics, oil spills, those are all threats to the health of our ocean. Okay? Other things include climate change. Maybe you guys have heard of that before or heard those words. And as our atmospheric temperatures continue to go up, so does the temperature of our oceans. And this kelp forest thrives in very cool water, very nutrient-rich water. And so as the water temperature continues to go up, it threatens the health of some of these ecosystems like the kelp forest. Another threat is what we call or refer to as ocean acidification. Okay, as more carbon is being released into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, a lot of that carbon is being absorbed by our oceans, causing it to become more acidic. And that acidic seawater is having an effect on a lot of animals that have calcium shells. A lot of sea slugs or mollusks, crabs, lobsters are all negatively impacted by that change in pH in the water. So those are some current threats, but I don't want to end with doom and gloom because there's so much that you and I can do to help protect our oceans and help keep it healthy. Do you guys have any ideas on ways that you can do that? What can you do?
To pick up trash?
Yes, to pick up trash. It seems so simple, right? But it's really important. Or even to just throw trash away in the proper receptacle. Maybe you guys could volunteer to do a beach cleanup. That's a good idea. Maybe eat seafood that's sustainably taken or harvested. You could walk more or ride your bike more and drive your car less. Yeah? Support efforts like marine reserves. These are all little things, but if we all do them together, we can have a larger impact and really make a difference and help keep this ocean system healthy because we rely on it, remember, for so much. We rely on it for recreation, as a food source, and that ever-important oxygen, remember, that we breathe every single day. So we're really, really connected to our oceans, and it's up to us to keep it healthy. Okay, so we can enjoy it now and also our future generations. And with this centennial year where we're celebrating 100 years of protecting places like this, you guys are the next generation of protectors, the next generation of stewards, and it's really up to you. The health of our ocean is in your hands, and I encourage you to become stewards, protectors of this ecosystem and our oceans around the world so that we can continue to enjoy it as we do now for many generations to come. So thank you all for joining us in this very special broadcast of Channel Islands Live. I hope you have enjoyed it. I've sure enjoyed being on this end. And I hope to see you next time underwater in the kelp forests at the Channel Islands. Bye-bye, everybody.
Hello from the Visitor Center.
Well, hello, Lizzie. How are you? I'd like to welcome you and all of our fourth graders from Graceville Elementary in Santa Paula to Channel Islands Live. And we are live and interactive, so let me hear everybody shout out a big hello and say hi to Ranger Dave. I'm Ranger Dave. Hello! Hello. And we also have watching today, some visitors here on Anacapa Island, and that's where I'm at. I'm actually underneath Anacapa Island. This is one of 5 islands that makes up Channel Islands National Park, and it's not just the islands above us, but it's the waters surrounding them that are part of this park. Half of this park is water. And in addition to those of you participating with us today from our Visitor Center Auditorium in Ventura and those of you watching on the island, I want to say a big hello also to everybody who's watching us live over the internet today. And I want to thank our tech partners, Ventura County Office of Education and Explore.org, for making it possible for all of you to come on a dive here in this national park. But unlike me, you don't have to get wet or be cold. And so today we are diving, as I mentioned, in a national park. These waters are also part of Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, and this particular spot in the Anacapa Island Landing Cove is also protected as a marine reserve. Ranger Lizzie, does anybody know what a marine reserve does? What is it for?
Stand by, Dave.
Okay.
I think we're not sure over here.
Well, in a way I'm glad, because it helps me to educate you about what a marine reserve is. It's an area in the ocean that fishing is not allowed in. So even though this is part of a national park and a national marine sanctuary, fishing is still allowed in some of the waters out here. But this particular area, it is not allowed in and hasn't been allowed for over 30 years. So that's your entire lives, all of you from Graceville, plus more. Maybe not all of your teachers, but for all the students. And because of that, the waters here, this forest that we're diving in, has a much more naturally functioning and well-balanced ecosystem than areas outside of the reserve. Now, I mentioned I'm diving in a forest. So if you guys know what kind of forest I'm diving in, just go ahead and everybody just shout it out. What kind of forest is this? Kelp forest, that's right. And a kelp forest is actually a forest. It is home to many animals. In fact, there's a lot of diversity here. There are over 1,000 different kinds of living things here in the kelp forest. But it's underwater, so it's very different than the forest you might go hiking in on the mainland near your homes, pine forests or oak woodlands. And kelp has adapted to this marine environment in a few ways. So let me show you one of the ways. Instead of having a rigid, solid trunk that's stiff, kelp has these bands of flexible, tube-like things called stipes. And they allow the kelp to move back and forth when the swell or the surge down here is pushing on it. Also, on land, most of the nutrients are in the soil. So land trees and land plants have roots to drop the nutrients and the moisture. But here, all of those things are in the water around us. So kelp has these leaf-like blades that actually, along with the stipes, can absorb nutrients right out of the water. So these are adaptations that enable the kelp to really thrive here in this environment. Now there's one other interesting adaptation. It's these little bulb-like things. They're called pneumatocysts, and they're filled with air. And does anyone know, Lizzie, does someone in our audience in Ventura know what is the purpose of this adaptation?
It's to help the plants breathe.
Well, actually plants do breathe. They use a process called photosynthesis, and this is linked to that. It's not actually what allows us to breathe, but they use something, and these bulbs filled with air float the kelp up to the surface, and our photographer, Ranger Kelly, is going to aim the camera up, and everybody shout out, what is it that the kelp is reaching for at the surface? Sunlight. Now, I heard someone say oxygen, and oxygen is a part of this breathing, if we want to call it that process, photosynthesis for the plant. It actually, through those bulbs, floats up to the surface. It's anchored to rocks on the bottom through a structure called a holdfast that hooks it to the rocks. And when it gets to the surface, it spreads out, and it gets sunlight, and that sunlight is used through that process of photosynthesis to create glucose or sugars and also oxygen. In fact, kelp and other marine algae, this is actually not a plant. It looks like one perhaps, but it's a giant algae. They produce over half of the oxygen in the air that we breathe. Right down here in the ocean, they produce oxygen for us on land. So this is not just an important habitat for the animals that live down here, but it's important for us as well. So why don't we go ahead and drop down to the seafloor, and we have, I think I'm wrapped in the kelp, so I'll have to get loose from that, but we have a team of support divers down here, and let's see if they can find some of the creatures that actually rely on the kelp forest for their very survival, for habitat and for food. So we're going to make our way over here, I think, Kelly, and we'll find a nice area to settle down in on the bottom. And you can see, I picked this spot because there is a rock here, and we can see, in fact, this is making it easy for me, I think. I can pick this rock up, and you can see the holdfast, the structure that anchors kelp to the rocks. This is a small one hooked to a little rock, but it still works like an anchor. Bigger strands of kelp have bigger holdfasts that actually act like little habitat structures, and all kinds of things live even in the holdfast, very small organisms. So that's the kelp. You can also see this rock here covered in other kinds of algae, and you'll notice that here in the ocean, in this kelp forest, there's very little surface area that isn't covered with some kind of life. So there's all kinds of different things, diversity of life, but there's also this abundance. And so there's competition, and there's a balance and an interplay between the animals. And I'm going to call in one of our support divers, Dan, and he has a couple of animals. Thank you, Dan. And everybody go ahead and just shout out if you know, what am I holding in my hands? Urchins, yeah. They look like pincushions a little bit. These are two different kinds, and they're animals. And, you know, in the kelp forest, the kelp is a producer. It produces food. And do you think these are producers, or are these consumers? You guys have done a little prep work for early in the school year. That's really good. So these consume. Let's keep going with that line of thought. What do they consume? Kelp. These are grazers. They consume the kelp, so they'll eat kelp. Now, they're important for the balance of life here. There are animals that eat these, that prey on them. So predators rely on these species, but they rely on the kelp. So indirectly, the predators also rely on the kelp for survival. Without kelp, there wouldn't be as many urchins for them to eat. Now, they're very different, these two kinds of urchins. In my right hand is a purple urchin, and in my left hand is one that's called a coronado urchin. And you can see the difference in size and color and the length of their spines. And so there's diversity even among different kinds of animals with multiple species. And if you have a simple change in the balance of how many of which kind or which species of urchins live in the kelp forest, it can have a drastic and dramatic effect. These little purple urchins unlike some other species, will actually eat the holdfasts as well as graze on the blades of the kelp or bits of the blades that break off. So if too many of the larger urchins, and some of the larger species are fished, red urchins in particular, people eat those in sushi restaurants, then purple urchins fill the void, and if that balance changes, purple urchin populations can skyrocket, and then they can destroy a kelp forest by eating all the holdfasts. So a real simple thing, how many of what kind of urchins are in the kelp forest can make the difference between a healthy, lush forest like this or an area where the rocks are just covered with thousands of purple urchins and nothing else. So I'm going to actually call in Ranger Dan and give the urchins back to him. Now, why do you think I'm giving the urchins back to Dan as opposed to just putting them on the bottom so they can eat the algae? Lizzie, does someone know?
Because if you leave them on the ground, they will start eating the kelp.
Well, they will start eating the kelp, and that's what they do, so that is actually okay. But those urchins, remember I mentioned there are predators down here that like to eat the urchins, and there's a fish called a sheephead that has been swimming around me. I don't see it right now because it wants to eat those urchins, and I don't want to give it a free lunch. It has to earn its lunch. So Dan is going to put those urchins in a safe place in a little crevice so that we, as park rangers and divers showing you the kelp forest, don't affect the life down here in any negative way. So we're being careful to help protect all of the animals here. Now, I'm going to laugh a little bit because check this out. I know you know what this is, so go ahead and shout out. What am I holding? And I know I watched last week. It looks really good on camera. It looks pretty mean with these teeth. And I'm showing this for a couple reasons as an example. So we found this down here in the kelp forest last week. We didn't bring it with us. And so this, even though this is sort of a fun toy that someone was probably playing with and lost here, or maybe it floated out all the way from the mainland, or maybe it swam. But even though we're in a protected area, there are still threats to the kelp forest here. And believe it or not, this toy shark is one of them. This is, even though it's a fun thing to have, we brought it back down to show you today as an example. This is a pollution item. This is a piece of plastic. It doesn't belong here. And this shark itself is probably not hurting that much, but little pieces of plastic, some of the animals eat those, and it causes them harm. And so even though we're offshore and in a protected area, there are still threats here. And so today we're going to explore not only the life down here, but we're going to see about a couple of those other threats and see if there are some simple things that we can all do to help protect the kelp forest. But I didn't just come here to show you toys, and so let me give that shark back to Dan and trade it for a real shark that I'll show you. And we'll give it just a second to get acclimated. This shark is called anybody know? Do you know the name of it? Here's a clue.
I think we're not quite sure.
It's a horn shark. Look at this horn on its dorsal fin. There's another one on its back fin. And that's where it gets its name. And we'll get a head-on shot. This shark seems to like being in the limelight. It's pretty happy here. But how many of you, just shout out if you would like to go swimming like we are today in shark-infested waters? And I'm not talking about toy sharks. I don't know why, Rachel, I always expect everybody to say, no, we don't want to swim with sharks. We're afraid of sharks. But everybody always says yes. And actually, yes is not a bad answer. There are some species of sharks that could be a threat to us. But you know what is a bigger threat? We are a bigger threat to sharks. This shark, I'll show you its mouth on the bottom, is a bottom-feeding shark. It eats small crustaceans, little fish, mollusks, things like that, that are in the sand. and it usually comes out at night to feed. It really poses no threat to us, but humans kill millions and millions of sharks every single year. I think the number, we were looking at it on the internet recently, is something like 14,000 an hour worldwide. Sharks are killed many times just for their fins, and the rest of the shark is discarded. So that's another threat to the kelp forest. This area is protected from fishing, but do you think that nobody ever fishes here? Or do you think sometimes people violate the rules and do fish in the reserve? Unfortunately. Now I'm going to give this shark back to, actually let's hold on for 1 second because I want to make one more point. The fishing, even though sometimes people do poach in the reserves, one of the things that we do, and also the State Department of Fish and Wildlife and other agencies, is patrol and try to protect and keep people from fishing in the reserves and informing them if they don't know, and sometimes we have to cite them if they are doing it knowingly. But also just by having reserves, we have areas where these fish can live unharassed, not be taken out of the waters, and grow to be large and old and have a large population and help keep fish numbers at an appropriate level. And so having protected areas helps protect against overfishing. So let me go ahead and give the shark back to Ranger Dan for the same reason we gave him the urchin, so that he can put the shark back into a nice safe place, because it normally during the day will be in a small crevice or crack and hiding out. So we've discussed a couple of the threats to the kelp forest, and now I see that Ranger Dan's been very busy. I actually had to hold him off a minute ago. And let's see if, whoops, nice catch. That was, we call that a save down here. So go ahead and shout out what animal am I holding now? And this is a California spiny lobster. I'm going to just tuck his tail in a little bit. And this animal is another story about the importance of protected areas and how marine reserves help protect the diversity of life and the abundance of life down here. It doesn't have claws like a lot of the lobsters you'll see in New England or in your grocery store or on a dinner plate in a restaurant. Instead, it has these sharp horns and bumps on its shell that help to protect it. And it has these long antennae in the front that act as sensory organs to help it to find its way and find food and navigate through its territory. But lobsters, like many marine animals, the older they get and the bigger they get, and this is a medium-sized male lobster. Let's open the tail and you can get a look at how long it is. The bigger they get, the more offspring they produce. And not just for here in the reserve, but those larvae will drift way offshore, and as they grow into lobsters, into adult lobsters, they make their way back all up and down the coast. So protected areas like this help to populate populations of lobsters and other animals outside of the reserves as well. And, you know, they don't have claws, but these tails are very popular. People like to eat lobster, so there's a lot of fishing pressure on them, again, outside of the reserves. So I'm trying to see bright lights here, so it's a little hard to see, but I'm going to call in Ranger Dan again, or one of my support divers, because I want to give the the lobster back to them, to, just like all those other animals, tuck it safely away, and that's Ranger Jeff, our other support diver, and also help protect that lobster. So today, our divers have done a good job, and we've seen quite a few of the animals that rely on the kelp forest for survival, and we've talked a little bit about how this area is protected and some of the importance of that, but also some of the threats. So are there any other threats that you guys can think of that could affect this area? Ranger Lizzie?
Trash.
Trash is a good one. That shark was a good example, but you know, when you throw something out, or if you have lunch on the beach and you don't watch it and the seagulls get into it, spread it all around, all of that trash, eventually a lot of it will blow into or wash down creeks, even if you're not at the beach, into the ocean, floats around out here, and even in the farthest reaches of the ocean, thousands of miles from land, there's still trash, plastics and things floating around. So while this is a beautiful area, it's relatively clean, it's relatively healthy, pollution is also something that is threatening to it. Now, what can you do? Rachel, Lindsay, does someone know what can you do, what can they do to help protect this kelp forest and all of the oceans from pollution and trash?
Don't throw trash in the ocean.
That's right. I set up an easy question, but it's an important one. Don't throw trash in the ocean on purpose or accidentally by throwing trash away improperly outside of the ocean that will eventually make its way into the ocean. And so that's a great thing, an easy little thing we can all do. And collectively, when we all do that together, it has a really big effect in keeping the oceans clean. We talked about fishing and how a change in the amount of urchins due to fishing or other things, the shark fishing for their fins, can have an effect on the balance of life here and how many animals there are. And so one thing you can do if you like to fish, fishing can be a great sport if you're interested in it. And a lot of us, myself included, like to eat fish, but we need to fish in a sustainable way, in a way that doesn't deplete too many of the fish, so that we'll have large lobsters, like that one we showed you, to help reproduce and keep populations healthy. And so just by being careful in how you fish, following the rules. Don't fish in a marine reserve. Eat fish that are harvested or fished in a sustainable way. You're helping the ocean. So those are two really good ways. There's a third way that I'm thinking of that you are all helping protect the ocean. And you know what? Whether you know it or not, you're doing it right now. You're learning about the ocean. And by learning about the ocean, you know more about it. You gain a better appreciation for it. And you can also tell other people what you've learned and help them become more knowledgeable. And that actually helps protect the ocean in a really big way. Not just the ocean, but the entire environment, even outside of the ocean. Everything is linked. Watersheds, rivers on the mainland, linked to the ocean. When you go up to the surface here, you go from underwater to the above water atmosphere. And remember, early on in this program, we talked about kelp and other marine algae even producing a large amount, more than half, of all the oxygen on the planet. So this area, again, is not just important for the animals that live here, that rely on it for survival, but we rely on the kelp forest for survival as well. So I hope you've learned a lot today and gotten that better appreciation to help protect the kelp forest. And I'd like to ask all of you to join me and take a deep breath. And as you exhale, realize that that deep breath, some of that oxygen came right here from the kelp forest. And we want to keep the kelp forest healthy, not just for us, not just for all those animals we saw today, but for our children and their children and their children, for all of the future generations as well. So Rachel, Lizzie, all the students and teachers and parents from Grace Hill, everybody here on Anacapa and the internet, thank you for joining us down here in the kelp forest today for Channel Islands Live. And I'll say goodbye from underwater. And those of you on the surface, Okay, well, hello everybody watching us today. I'm Dave Began. I'm a park ranger here at Anacapa Island, or I should say today underneath Anacapa Island. This is part of Channel Islands National Park, and our program is called Channel Islands Live, and we are live and interactive. And today, we're really happy to be joined by a large number of adult education centers. And so let's start with our good friends in Ventura, Hans, with the Ventura Avenue Senior Center. Can I hear a big shout out hello from everybody watching over there today? Hello. And we're also joined through the Senior Learning Network. Stand by, Josh. There's a giant sea bass that just came into view, so we're just going to interrupt. Oh my gosh. I don't know that we've ever seen that so well live. That's proof that we are live. We couldn't find that. That's probably a 500-pound black sea bass or giant sea bass. That was incredible. It just came out of nowhere. We have a team of support divers down here helping us out, and they pointed it out. I'm actually fairly blinded by the bright lights of the camera, so thank you, Diver Dan, for helping us there. Well,
Central casting comes through again.
Yeah, we will. What a great way to start our program today. And we are also joined by a large number of adult education centers that are linked to us through the Senior Learning Network. So, Alan, let me have a big shout out to all of your people all over the country that are joining us today.
Say hi, guys. Hello. Thank you.
And Ellen, how many different locations are we broadcasting out to through your bridge?
Right now I'm showing 11.
11 different places in 11 spots around the country. So hello to all of you. We're also joined by thousands of people watching us live as we stream on Facebook over the internet. And I'd like to thank our tech partners, Ventura County Office of Education, and Explore.org for helping to make that possible today. And last but not least, those of you here on the surface of Anacapa Island that rode out on the boat with us today on the Vanguard, who are watching us from the dock on monitors, and we even have people swimming around in the water. So we're just immersed in the water and immersed in people who are interested in what's in the water here. And that's what we're going to be showing you today. We started with giant sea bass. I'm not sure how we topped that, but we are in a towering kelp forest. And have any of you ever been out here? Those of you in Ventura, Hans, let's ask your group to the Channel Islands on the boat. I couldn't quite hear you. You'll say it a little bit louder.
Yes, a couple of people raised their hand.
A couple have, okay. So you've seen the kelp forest out here most likely. And kelp is actually, this is literally a forest, an underwater forest. But it's actually not a plant. It's a giant algae. And it is the main structure of this forest. It provides food and shelter, not just for that giant sea bass, but also for about 1,000 different types of living organisms, from microscopic plankton all the way up to blue whales, the largest animals ever to have lived on the planet, can be found around the Channel Islands. And kelp itself, it's not really a plant, even though this is a forest, it's an algae. And let's move a little bit over here, Josh, because I want to show you a really good example of how kelp is perfectly adapted to this underwater environment. So on land, and I think we have people from all types of different ecosystems watching today and participating, but on land, in a forest, trees have a rigid trunk. But underwater, because the water's moving so much, kelp actually has these flexible, pliable features called stipes, and so it can flow back and forth with the motion of the ocean. And another adaptation kelp has to the underwater environment is that down here, as opposed to a land forest where the nutrients are mostly in the soil, here we're swimming in a soup of nutrients. It's all around us in the water, and kelp can absorb the nutrients right out of the water through its leaf-like blades, through the stipes themselves, and can take advantage of the richness of the liquid and environment here.
Because it was going fine just a second ago.
Does someone have a question? Okay, we'll continue on. So the last adaptation I'll show you are these bulbous features. They're gas-filled bladders. And is there anyone out there who knows why kelp would have that feature as an adaptation? I think I heard someone say it helps it to float.
It's something in your computer.
Yeah.
Don't let it project into here.
Yeah, it actually floats the kelp right up to the surface. And Josh, why don't we aim the camera up and you can get a good shot of the sunlight streaming through. Even though we are in about 25 feet of water right now, sunlight does reach through here. And through the process of photosynthesis, kelp converts that energy into glucose and also into oxygen. In fact, kelp and other marine algae produce over half of the oxygen in the air we breathe every day. So this is an important aspect of the kelp forest, of course, for all the animals that live here, but also important to you and I. And one thing that's really special about where we are today is that this particular area, it's part of Channel Islands National Park. It's also part of Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. And on top of that, this specific area that we're diving in has been protected for over 30 years as a marine reserve. So no fishing is allowed here. Animals like the giant sea bass are protected as a species, and that type of ecosystem management has been happening for a long time. But it's not always as effective as we would like in maintaining species. Some species have declined in the oceans, as I'm sure you're aware. And so this is an attempt to have an ecosystem-based management system in order to have a more naturally functioning environment. And that's important because it helps this area to become more resilient to changes that could occur here, because there are still threats to the kelp forest. So Josh, why don't we drop down to the bottom, maybe right over here, and let's see if our support divers have had a chance to locate some of the creatures that rely on the kelp forest for survival. And I actually see that Dan, who pointed out that giant sea bass, has a couple of animals that he's going to bring over here. Thank you, Dan. So does anybody know what animals I'm holding in my hands? And Hans, let's go to Ventura. Anybody?
Sea urchin.
Sea urchins, that's right. And I have two different species. The one in my left hand is a purple sea urchin. Now they're both in my left hand. The one in my right hand is called a coronado urchin. So you can see that there is quite a bit of variety in urchins. One has long spines that are highly flexible. The other has short spines. And just a simple change in the balance of how many of each species live down here can have a dramatic effect on the kelp forest. There's a species similar to the coronado urchin, which is a very active animal right now, called a red urchin that is eaten as a sushi item in sushi restaurants. It's known as uni when it's on our plate. Hang on, we're getting a little bit of a swell knocking us around. And if too many of these are fished out in areas that are not marine reserves, or too many of the red urchins, these purple urchins fill the void. and they will eat all the kelp. So these are grazers. Purple urchins will actually eat the portion of the kelp that anchors it to the rocks. And so if we overfish, we can change the balance of life down here, and all of this kelp will disappear. And I'm going to tell you an example by calling Dan back in of changes that have occurred here recently. So I'm going to give Dan the urchins. Take the card, another one. And those urchins will be put into a crevice so that they'll be protected against predators, because we don't want to give any of the predators that live down here a free lunch. They have to earn it on their own. But who knows what I'm holding in my hand now? We'll go to Senior Learning Network. Do any of your people know? What is this?
Looks like a sea star.
It looks like a sea star. It's a piece of a sea star. And it's an example of a change that has occurred here. This year, we had a drastic water temperature change with the El Nino atmospheric event, and for some reason, a disease went through the sea star populations called wasting disease, and almost all of the sea stars that were numerous died off here. And this is just a little bit that's left of a sea star that recently succumbed to this. And fortunately, though, we are starting to see sea stars return, and that's a sign of the resilience of this particular kelp forest. So let's do another trade-off. And this is our, actually, I'm just going to put, okay, I'll give that back to, that's our support diver, John, who's been helping out as well. And I'll take both of those. So I have two different animals, a grazer in my left hand and a decomposer in my right hand. And we're getting maybe a little more challenging as we go, but does anybody know what this animal is? Just shout it out if you do.
At the sea slug?
Sea slug is a good answer, and in particular it's called a sea hare, and it's very buoyant. And sea hares graze on kelp. They're called sea hares because they have these appendages that look like rabbit ears. And this is a sea cucumber that is a decomposer. So think of this as like the earthworm of the sea. Now, does anybody want to eat one of these? Let me hear a big shout out if you think this would be a great meal. I don't hear anything. But people actually do eat these, and outside of the reserves, there are very few sea cucumbers left because they are harvested and eaten. And so they act again like earthworms. They help to keep the bottom sand loose, and there are other animals, small crustaceans and things that live in the sand.
For a second and leave the meeting and start.
So they're important for the environment. Now I'm going to go ahead and set down the sea cucumber because it will be just fine on the ground there. But the sea hare, I'll tell you one other interesting fact. This is not only a diverse environment, but it's very abundant. There are a lot of things living down here. Almost every surface area is covered with life. And it's said that sea hares, if they were to lay their eggs, which they do, they look like masses of spaghetti. And if every egg that a sea hare in the kelp forest laid hatched, and all of those eggs grew to maturity as sea hares and laid eggs and those hatched, it would only take about, this one's crawling around my glove, 6 months for the entire planet to be covered several feet deep in these animals, in sea hares. So it's just an idea of the abundance of the sea, and the bigger they get and the older they get, the more offspring they produce. Unlike us, where we have a curve in our production of children based on age. So I'm going to go ahead, let's lay this sea hare. Josh will put it right down on this piece of kelp and let it have a meal there. And notice how it camouflages in so well, the color of it and the markings on it. And that is a, of course, way that it helps protect itself. So let's move a little bit more, Josh. Is that okay if we go right over here to this rocky area? Because we're getting a little bit of surge here, and it's sort of throwing us off a little bit. So we're just going to kind of make our way. This is a nice spot. I'm going to drop down back to the bottom. And let's take a look at one more animal that Dan has found. And, thanks, Dan. I'll almost let this one go. Hang on a second. I'm caught up in the kelp myself. Bear with me for 1 second. There we go. Okay, so this is a California spiny lobster. And unlike those of you who are watching us across the country in the Atlantic regions, you may be familiar with New England lobsters that have claws. But here, California spiny lobsters have big tails and these antennae that they use as sensory organs. They're protected by the spines on their shell, so thus the California spiny lobster. This one is a male. I can tell by the markings on its tail, and it's a medium-sized lobster. But outside of the reserve, this would probably end up becoming dinner on somebody's dinner plate. And here in the reserve, this lobster can live to be large and become very old. And as I mentioned, just like that sea hare, it will produce more and more offspring, eggs that become larvae. And the lobsters in the reserves, when those eggs hatch, they'll float way offshore and then back ashore, all up and down the coast, even in areas that are not protected as marine reserves. So marine reserves are a source of a production of sea life for even areas that are outside of the reserves themselves. Now, I'm going to bring Dan back in, give him this lobster back, because, and I'm going to take one more thing from him. We want to put that lobster, just like those sea urchins, back in a nice safe spot. And I'll show you a shark. This is also a first for Channel Islands Live. But our divers, while they were looking for animals down here, found a toy shark. I swear we did not bring this as a prop. And it's one example of one of the threats to the kelp forest. We've always joked about bringing, Josh and I have always joked about bringing a toy shark down here, and one just appeared. So what's the threat that this toy underwater here, this plastic toy, represents to the kelp forest? I think you all know. Pollution. So even though we are offshore, we're actually up current of most of the pollution sources, and we're in a national park, national marine sanctuary, and marine reserve. We're not so far away that we're immune to threats like pollution, like plastics floating offshore. Now, this is sort of a funny one, and we'll probably keep this. We'll definitely take it out of the ocean. And so we're not going to give this back to our divers to save it. We're going to give it back to them to remove it from the area. But there's not a place in the world where there aren't plastics found floating in the oceans. And so there are still some threats to this marine environment. Does anybody else have an idea as to what another threat might be to this kelp forest? Hans, let's go to Ventura.
Boats. They're saying boats.
Boats? Yeah, boats indirectly. A boat could sink, and it would have fuel in it and other contaminants, and it does happen out here. We get rough weather sometimes. And there are also oil rigs offshore. There could be an oil spill. Those are all types of pollution. Boats could pose another threat, though, because people fishing off of boats, and outside of the reserve, it is allowed here in the park and sanctuary. They could poach inside a sanctuary, and it does happen sometimes. Or if too many fish, like those sea urchins I mentioned, they're not fish, but animals down here, get removed from the system, it changes the balance of life. And so overfishing, or fishing in an unsustainable way, is also a threat to this ecosystem. And one of the other ones we've touched on already, it's changing climate. And so just like that sea star we saw that was affected by the warming waters or the disease that may have been linked to that. We're not sure. Those sea stars, which were abundant, play a role in the balance of life here. Now, we're hoping and we're starting to see a recovery in that species, and that will help to restore the natural balance out here. But if the water is warm too much, the kelp that lives in a certain temperature range, let's say the high 40s into the 60s here, upper 60s at most, will die off. And we did see that this year. Now that the waters have cooled again, the kelp has grown back, showing that resilience. But of course, if the kelp disappears, all of these creatures we've seen that rely on it for survival will disappear as well. So today, starting with that giant sea bass, which was a really neat surprise, and if you want to see it again, this program is being archived on our park webpage through our Facebook page, and you can watch it again. I'm going to. The lobster, the sea urchins, all of these animals show you the diversity and the abundance of life that is down here in Channel Islands National Park. Half this park is made up of underwater ocean areas, and we've seen a little bit about how even in a protected area, these animals, this whole ecosystem does face some threats, but we've seen how marine reserves and ecosystem management, fishing in a sustainable way, being careful about not polluting, all of these things can help protect this kelp forest. And remember, early on, I mentioned that this is not just an important place for all the animals that live here, but the oxygen that is produced by the plants and algae in the ocean allow us to survive on this planet as well. So take a deep breath along with me. And as you exhale, I hope that all of you do what you can to help protect the oceans, support areas like marine reserves, and on this nearing 100th anniversary of the National Park Service, help us to protect all these wildlands, not just for us, but for future generations as well. So I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today, and I'll say goodbye from Underwater Anacapa and from Channel Islands Live. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, Anacapa. This is the visitor center.
Well, hello, Bonnie. Welcome. Just give Josh a second. He's turning our brand new lights on. So, hello. I want to welcome everybody who's watching today, both at our visitor center auditorium in Ventura, here on Anacapa, live over the internet to Channel Islands Live. I'm Ranger Dave, and yes, I'm at work right now. I have a great job. I'm underwater at Anacapa Island, one of 5 islands in Channel Islands National Park. And today, we're coming to you live from the beautiful landing cove at Anacapa Island. And we are interactive with those of you in Ventura and here on Anacapa. So, Bonnie, let's start with Ventura. And I think we have a few people there this afternoon. Let me hear a shout-out hello from everybody watching in Ventura. All right. Maybe a bigger audience than I thought. That was nice and loud. And Bree here on Anacapa, let's hear a big shout-out hello from everybody up on the dock here. All right. And we have a lot of people watching us over the internet as well. And I want to thank our tech partners, Ventura County Office of Education, and Explore.org for helping us to bring you live down here into this underwater realm. And while most people who are familiar with Channel Islands National Park know that it is made up of 5 islands off the coast of Southern California, not everybody is aware that it's not just the islands, that the waters surrounding the islands are part of the park as well. In fact, half of this park is underwater, and we're also diving in Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary today. There's an overlap here. So how many of you from both our audiences just shout it out if you think that these waters are protected because they're part of a national park and a national marine sanctuary?
Yes.
Yeah. And they are protected. However, it's also surprising to some people to find out that you can still fish in most of the waters around and in Channel Islands National Park. Only 20% or so of the waters are protected from fishing, and this is one of those areas. It's a marine reserve, and this particular marine reserve has been off limits to fishing for almost 35 years. And so because of that, the area that we're diving in here today has a much more naturally functioning and balanced ecosystem than areas outside of the reserve where fishing still occurs. Now, I'm not only diving in these waters, I'm actually coming to you from an underwater forest. So, Bonnie, let's ask our visitors in Ventura if they could just shout out, if you know, what kind of a forest am I diving in today?
Kelp.
Kelp forest, yeah. And most people are familiar with kelp. If you're not a diver, from the big piles of decaying kelp on the beach, and they might smell a little bit. They're part of the ecosystem as well. All that nutrient recycles. But down here, where it's living, it's this fantastic, towering forest of life. And giant kelp is the primary structure down here. It's actually an algae, not a plant, and it can grow at an incredible rate, about 2 feet a day this time of year. And it is only one of many kinds of algae. There are also a few plants down here, many kinds of animals, over 1,000 different types of living things in the waters here in the kelp forest. So there's this great diversity and abundance down here, and we hope to show you. We're live. We never know what we're going to see, but we do have a team of support divers with us today, my cameraman Josh and I, and we hope to show you some of the animals that rely on kelp for habitat, food, protection, and for their very survival. So let's start by taking a look at giant kelp itself, because it's actually very well adapted to this environment. Bree, do we have anyone here on the island who might have a guess or an idea of one way, there are many ways, that kelp has adapted or is adapted to this underwater environment?
Kelp adapted to that underwater environment. Does anyone have a good guess of that?
It floats.
It floats.
It floats, yeah, absolutely. It's actually anchored to the bottom through something that looks like roots called a holdfast, but isn't roots at all. Kelp absorbs nutrients through its leaf-like blades right out of the water. Here in the ocean, the nutrients are all around us. We're diving in a soup of nutrients, as opposed to a forest on land where the nutrients are mostly in the soil and get sucked up by roots. But kelp needs to float up to the surface. It has another adaptation. These flexible, pliable stipes allow it to flow, as you can see, with the motion of the ocean. And it has these gas-filled bladders called pneumatocysts, and they buoy the kelp up to the surface so that it can float. And Josh, why don't you aim up there and we'll take a look, and everybody just shout out, what is it that kelp is reaching for up at the surface? Sunlight. So even though we're underwater, the sun is the driving energy force of this forest. So even though things are different underwater, there are some similarities to a land forest in that photosynthesis still occurs. So those gas-filled bladders lift the kelp up to the surface. It spreads out in a canopy in places. It can tower up over 100 feet tall. So this is truly a forest down here. And through the process of photosynthesis, kelp converts the energy of the sun into food, glucose, but also a really important thing. Over half of the oxygen that you breathe in the air you breathe every day comes from kelp and other marine algae. So this is a production source for oxygen for all of us. So Josh, why don't we drop down to the bottom and let's see if we can find, with the help of our divers, some of the animals that rely on the kelp forest for survival. And while we're down here, I think I see a good example. Give you a quick shot of, this will be interesting because I can actually lift it up. This is the holdfast. I don't like to talk about things I can't show you. And so these are not roots. These are an anchoring system that holds the kelp to the rocks. Why do you think that would be important? Bonnie, someone in Ventura, want to tell us, we know why kelp floats to the surface. Why does it anchor to the bottom? So it won't float away. That maybe was too easy of a question, but everything's in balance. It's anchored to the bottom. It floats up to the surface. It stays in place. It gets sunlight. And let me call in. I see our support diver, John, has a really neat example of one of the animals that is a part of that balance. Everybody shout it. I think you all know what I'm holding in my hands. Sea urchin. This is an unusual kind of sea urchin, actually, compared to the ones that we see most commonly here. This is called a coronado urchin. It has very long spines, and they're very flexible. And the urchin is actually a grazer. Bits of kelp will break off from the main structure of the plant and get caught in the spines, and it can use those flexible spines to move it around along with its tube feet to its mouth in the center. You guys able to see the mouth there?
Yes.
Okay. So how is this important to the balance of life in the kelp forest? Well, it is a grazer, so it eats kelp. If the population of urchins spikes, they'll eat a lot of the kelp. If the population's in balance, they eat just enough to keep the kelp forest healthy, but to not decimate the forest. There's something that has happened over time with certain species of urchin that has thrown that balance off. And Bree, does anyone here have any idea what activity, what we have done that might alter the balance of urchins in the oceans around the Channel Islands?
No predators?
No predators. Okay, that's part of it. A lot of the predators in areas where fishing is allowed are hunted out, and so that has decreased the amount of urchins in those areas. And also, people are predators on urchins as well. There's a similar species to this called the red urchin that is eaten in sushi bars. It's called uni. And where red urchins are heavily fished, their smaller cousin, the purple urchin, takes their place to fill that void. And purple urchins don't just eat drift kelp, they'll actually eat the holdfasts. And the person who said holdfasts keep the kelp in place was absolutely right. If the holdfasts are destroyed, the kelp floats away. And so a change in the balance of urchins from more coronado and red urchins to more purple urchins can completely destroy a kelp forest. So balance matters down here, and being in a protected area helps preserve that balance. I'm going to actually give this urchin back to John because we want to protect the urchins too, and instead of just letting it go where one of these fish might eat it, we don't want to give them a free lunch. So he'll put it back into a protected crevice where it can continue grazing on kelp and being a part of this ecosystem. So that's just one example of an animal that lives down here in the kelp forest and relies on it for survival. And I actually, through our bright lights, can actually see that I have another one I'm about to show you because our other support diver, Julian, is bringing in a California. It's got a good grip on him. Let's see if we can let it release from Julian. And there we go. So this is a California spiny lobster that really liked Julian. So it had a nice grip. You can see how it clenches on. And it's actually quite strong. These are powerful animals and very fast swimmers. They'll swim backwards using their big tail as almost like a jet to thrust them. They don't have claws, though, like a Maine lobster or a New England lobster. They have these spines on their shell to protect them, and these long antennae, which are sensory organs. And marine reserves, this is a big male, big female. I can tell by these large swimmerettes, which she would use to hold her eggs if she had a clutch of eggs. Now, people, of course, like to eat lobster, and so these are heavily fished in areas where fishing is allowed, and that affects their overall age and size. In the marine reserves, we see older, larger lobsters, and many animals in the ocean, as they get bigger and older, produce more young. So having protected areas like this allows these to get bigger, produce more larvae, which helps populate lobster populations, not just in the reserves, but outside as well. The larvae float way offshore and then float back in to the coast, all up and down their range. This is a predator as well as a scavenger, also important for the balance of life here. You can see how well it camouflages in to the bottom colors and the algae, and it will also take advantage of cracks and crevices for protection. Now, there are fish here that will also eat these, that would love to make a lunch out of this lobster. So I'm going to do the same thing we did with the urchin. I'm going to give the lobster back to Julian, and he is going to tuck it away in a nice cave so that it can continue on with its role in the ecosystem. And things are just coming at us right and left here, so let's bring our other support diver, John, back in. This is another creature, and we're starting to see the level of diversity here in that the divers are bringing animals to me right and left, literally. And does anyone know what this is? Bonnie, let's go to Ventura.
Stand by.
Sea slug?
Yeah, sea slug is a good guess. Bree, let's try here in Anacapa. Anybody know?
A snare?
Alien.
I heard sea snake, alien, and...
Alien? No one said rabbit. So this is a type of sea slug. It's called a sea hare. It has these rabbit-like appendages that look like rabbit ears, and that's where it gets its name. And this is also a grazer, very common here in the kelp forest. And again, you can see how this camouflages into the algae on the bottom and grazes on it as well. And this is, I want to show you something as an example. Let's see if I can do this. Come here, John. There are two different kinds of sea hares down here. And so two different species, big and little, but they do the same thing. They graze on algae. And they're actually a link between slugs and snails. They have a little micro shell. And when we talk about breeding and abundance, I'll give you a quick fact about sea hares. It's said that if every sea hare in the ocean laid its eggs, and they look like masses of spaghetti when they come out. And all of those eggs hatched, and all of those grew to maturity and laid eggs, and their eggs hatched. What a hand. Look how it's looking right at the camera. And that within a matter of about 6 months, the entire planet would be covered several feet deep in sea hares. Now, of course, you're not sitting in a 3 feet or 6 feet of sea hare right now. I think I am. But it's just another example of the abundance down here. And, of course, most of those eggs become food for other animals. So let's go ahead and this sea hare seems to be really friendly, and I'm going to give it back to John. I'm going to put this one down. And Josh, let's just take a look at how this sea hare camouflages in, because this is an animal that will be safe and right at home, right on the bottom here. So I'm going to actually put it on a piece of kelp and let it get to grazing. And you can see how it really blends right in. It can stick to the kelp. Not something you see every day. A slug might not seem like the most interesting creature, but it actually is a vital part of the kelp forest. And that big one is really certainly an interesting thing to see on camera. Now, we're seeing great examples of the diversity of life here, the abundance of the kelp forest in this protected area, but there are still some threats to the kelp forest, even out here. And there are some very simple things that you all can do to help to protect the kelp forest. So let's start with Ventura. And Bonnie, does anyone there have any ideas as to what might be a threat to this beautiful environment we're diving in today? Okay, global warming, climate change. That's definitely something that can affect the kelp forest. In fact, I'll give you a good example of that. As water temperatures rise, the kelp tends to diminish. Kelp thrives in a certain temperature range between the 40s and the 60s, and this year we had an El Nino event, and the water's warmed into the 70s, and all of this towering, streaming kelp that Josh is showing you disappeared. And think about what that means to the animals we've seen so far that rely on the kelp for survival. Now, kelp also, as I mentioned, can grow a couple feet a day. So as the water's cooled, the kelp grew back. And that is really a good thing for this guy. So once again, shout out if you know what I'm holding here. What kind of animal is this?
Shark.
A shark, yeah. This is a horn shark. You can see its horn on its dorsal fins. That's where it gets its name. And sometimes people are surprised that we're down here diving with sharks. But you can see this is pretty docile. This animal is not a threat. It's a bottom feeder. You can see its teeth on the bottom of its head, on its mouth. And it eats crustaceans and mollusks, small fish. It usually hunts at night. And while some people are leery of sharks because they hear about occasional shark attacks, it's really sharks that should worry about people, because millions of sharks are killed every year by people, oftentimes just for their fins. And so, as a top predator, they're really a key part of the kelp forest environment, and it's important that we help to protect them as well. Now, I'm going to go ahead and I've got a little surge coming through here, so I'm steadying myself. I'm going to let this shark swim off, and let's see if we can get a nice shot of it as it gracefully makes its way through the kelp. Also very well camouflaged, as you can see. And that takes us back to the importance of marine reserves for balance. Having this ecosystem be more naturally functioning because it's protected keeps that balance of life from predators and prey, things like sharks and sea urchins. And what makes that really important, we looked at a couple of threats today. Fishing, how that can alter the ecosystem. Marine reserves help to keep that in balance. Climate change, how that can affect the ecosystem. And as I mentioned, all of this kelp disappeared just a few months ago, and it's grown back. And we've seen in a short amount of time all of this life down here. And one of the things that makes this area so important for all of the areas around the islands is that because it's a protected area, it is more resilient. This naturally functioning ecosystem can bounce back from changes, things like that El Nino event this past winter, and hopefully be a hedge against some of the threats. Pollution, climate change, overfishing. And as we saw in that lobster, that helps protect not just this kelp forest, but all the kelp forests around the Channel Islands. And that's not just for us, not just for these animals, not just so we can have that basic necessity of oxygen to breathe, but it's important for our children and their children and future generations as well. So I encourage all of you to help support efforts like marine reserves and to do the simple things that you can do to help protect the ocean. Eat sustainable seafood. Throw your trash away properly so it doesn't flow into the ocean from storm drains. And be mindful about your consumption in order to help minimize the effects of things like climate change. So I hope you've seen some of the beauty of the kelp forest today, some of the creatures who live here, and a little bit about why the kelp forest is important to all of us. So with that, I will say goodbye from Underwater Anacapa. And those of you on the island, I'll see you on the surface. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Hello, Anacapa. This is the Visitor Center here in Ventura.
Well, hello, Lizzie. Welcome. I want to welcome you and our audience in Ventura at our Visitor Center. I understand we have a large group of Ventura Junior lifeguards there today, so let me hear you shout out a big hello.
Steve, we also have an audience up here at the landing cove.
All right, let me hear a big hello from our audience on Anacapa Island. Thank you, Bree. All right. And this is Channel Islands Live. I'm Ranger Dave. I'm lucky enough to be at work right now while I am underwater in the landing cove of Anacapa Island, which is one of 5 islands that make up Channel Islands National Park. And in addition to our 2 wonderful audiences on the mainland in Ventura and here on the surface in Anacapa, we're also joined today by people watching us live over the internet. And so I'd like to just shout out a thanks to Ventura County Office of Education and Explore.org for helping us to make this broadcast possible. And where we're coming to you from today is not just part of a national park. And yes, even underwater, we're in a national park. Channel Islands National Park is only half land, those 5 islands, but the other half of the park is made up of the waters that surround the islands. In addition, this is also part of Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary. So, does that sound to you guys? Everybody just shout out from both locations, like we are in a protected habitat? And you know, oddly enough, even in protected waters, national park, and National Marine Sanctuary, there are many places where it's not completely protected. Fishing is still allowed. In fact, those of you on the island, you can see those boats just off of Arch Rock this direction, and those boats are fishing. But if they come over to where we are, they'll be breaking the law, because this spot in addition to being national park and national marine sanctuary, is off limits to fishing because it is a marine reserve. And it has been one in this spot for over 35 years. And so because of that, what we see down here is a more balanced and naturally functioning ecosystem, or forest, that's what I'm diving in, than areas outside of the reserve that are still in the park and sanctuary, like where those boats are where fishing is allowed. Now, I mentioned that I'm diving in a forest. So anyone who knows what kind of forest I'm diving in, let me hear you shout that out too. That's right. And my cameraman Josh is showing you some fantastic shots of this streaming giant kelp. And giant kelp is actually not a plant, but an algae. There are many kinds of algae down here in the kelp forest. Giant kelp is the most predominant one, and it is the primary structure of the forest as well. And it looks like Josh has one of our resident fish, a female sheephead, just swimming by. And sheephead, like the roughly 1,000 different types of animals, plants, and algae that live in the kelp forest, rely on the kelp forest for food and also habitat, a place to live in the beginning of a web of life or a food chain. Kelp itself is perfectly adapted to this underwater environment. Unlike plants on land that have rigid, stiff trunks and branches, kelp has these flexible features called stipes, and it allows the kelp to move back and forth and flow with the motion of the ocean. Also, since here in the water, the nutrients are predominantly all around us in the water, as opposed to on land where they're in the soil, kelp can actually absorb nutrients directly through most of its parts, including these leaf-like blades and this other feature that has an important purpose. Do you see these bulbous, kind of look like little balloon features on the kelp? You guys can see that? Okay. So that's an important thing for kelp. What do you think it's doing? And Lizzie, perhaps somebody in Ventura would like to tell us, what is the purpose for kelp to have this adaptation?
To help it float.
Float, yeah, and Josh is going to aim up with the camera. And what is it that the kelp needs to float to the surface for?
Sunlight.
Sunlight, that's right. So kelp uses sunlight, and through the process of photosynthesis, it converts sunlight into energy, and that is the beginning of the food chain. It creates sugars or glucose, and it creates oxygen. In fact, over half the oxygen that you breathe in the air comes from kelp and other marine algae. So it's really important that we have protected areas like this where kelp can thrive. And Josh, why don't we drop down to the bottom here, and I actually have an animal, and let's move over this way a little bit. There's a nice little area over here, some good scenery. I have an animal that relies on kelp for survival. And so everybody go ahead and shout out, what kind of animal am I holding in my hand? Urchin, yeah. Now, some of you have, I'm just going to make a soft landing here, so stand by. Some of you have seen this program before, probably, and have seen me show a kind of sea urchin that might look like this, called a red sea urchin. Do any of you think this is a red sea urchin? No. I I was testing you. You guys are pretty sharp. Look how long its spines are. This is a different species that we haven't shown very often on Channel Islands Live. It's called a coronado urchin. But just like the red sea urchin, it is a grazer, and so it will catch bits of kelp that break off of the main structure or plant in its spines, and it will move them around. It's a little hard for me to hold this one because of its long spines. And can you guys see the mouth in the center of the bottom of the urchin?
Yeah.
Good. And so, just like the red and the purple urchin, this animal, again, uses its flexible spines and tube feet to bring the kelp around to its mouth in order to graze on the kelp. Now, we have had an imbalance at times in the kinds of urchins that are found down here, and that's because people eat one of the species, the red sea urchin, and so in areas where they can be fished, if too many red sea urchins are taken out of the ecosystem, along with predators like that sheephead we saw earlier, that big fish that eats sea urchins, we can end up with a population explosion of other species. Little purple ones is an example that will actually eat all the kelp and devour the entire kelp forest, and then the habitat is gone. So fishing is okay as long as we do it responsibly and keep a balance of life to keep the kelp forest healthy. This is one of the spots where we do that through reserves. So I'm going to go ahead and actually give this urchin to my support diver, John, so that he can make sure that he puts it into a nice crack or crevice in the reef where it will be safe, because we certainly don't want that sheephead to get a free lunch. So, and speaking of sheephead, Josh, there's a big male sheephead swimming around behind me, and he was probably looking for that free lunch, so I'm glad that John was here to help us to protect that sea urchin here in the marine reserve. So we've talked a little bit about how this area, because it's protected, is healthy. Here's a baby fish, Josh, a little baby kelp bass swimming around. There's a couple of them there. And so we have large mature animals here. We have small juveniles and a really good balance of life. But we've also seen how, one example with the sea urchins that I've discussed, how overfishing or fishing in an unsustainable way can affect the ecosystem down here. There are some other threats to the kelp forest, and we'll talk about those in a moment. And here comes our friend the sheephead again. But while we're doing that, I noticed that our other support diver, Julian, has found another animal that relies on the kelp forest for home and for survival. And so, take a look at that. Everybody go ahead. I know you know what this is, so just go ahead and shout out. What am I holding in my hand here? Lobster, yeah. One of the more popular animals in the kelp forest, both because they're really interesting animals to see and they play a vital role as scavengers and predators in the kelp forest balance of life, but also a species that, as you know, is impacted by fishing. Now, this is a male lobster. It has large paddle-like features called swimmerettes. I'm sorry, this is a female one, right, Josh? Female lobster, I believe. And it will reproduce. And in the reserve, these lobsters can get very large. This is medium size for here. But outside of the reserve, this would be a large lobster. And an interesting fact about many animals in the sea, like the lobster, is that the older they get and the larger they get, the more offspring they produce. And so by having areas like this where these animals can grow large, they help to keep the populations healthy, not just in the reserves, but also outside, because the offspring, the larvae that will hatch from the eggs of lobsters like this, drift way offshore, and then back in all up and down the coast throughout their range. So this is, again, a very important animal for the balance of life down here in the kelp forest. And so, again, because of that, I'm not going to just release it for that sheephead to try to eat it. I'm going to make sure that Julian gets a hold of it, and just like that urchin, he can put it into a nice crack or crevice or cave to where it can be healthy and survive. So we've seen a couple great examples of animals down here, and hopefully our divers will find some other animals as they swim around. But we've looked at overfishing as one of the threats to the kelp forest. Does anybody have any idea what another threat might be, even here in a protected area? Bree, why don't we go to the island audience, and let's see if anybody has any thoughts on that here.
Humans.
Yeah. They said people and humans.
People and humans, yeah. Well, we're responsible, unfortunately, for some of the threats here. Overfishing, as we talked about, but also pollution. Even in the farthest reaches of the ocean, there are plastics, pollution. There's potential for oil spills. There are oil fields offshore here. And so we can have an effect, even in another area. For instance, trash that goes into the ocean from the mainland could blow out here in the winds or the current. And so even though we're offshore in a protected area, we're not so far away that we're completely immune to things like that. Now, on a happier note, I'm going to bring John back in. And look at all these fish swimming around. Kelp bass and that sheephead. Oh my God, take a look at this, guys. This is one of the more interesting and larger things that we'll see today. And actually a very docile animal, even though it's big. Anybody know what this is? Bree, Lizzie, let's go to Ventura. Do any of the guards know what I'm holding?
Is it a sea hare?
It's a sea hare, yeah. And sea hares have these features that look like rabbit ears. That's where they get their name. And this is a very large one. This particular species grows this big. It's not uncommon. And it is like the sea urchin. It's a grazing animal. And it helps to eat the detritus. It's looking right at me. Hello, how are you? And I'll show you what the bottom looks like. You have to look at the camera. That's what we do here. And so an interesting fact about sea hares is that they're very prolific breeders. I mentioned about larger animals breeding more in the ocean, but when it comes to sea hares, the size doesn't matter so much for that. It's been said that if every sea hare egg laid, and they lay these eggs that look like big masses of spaghetti, were to hatch, and then all of the eggs those sea hares laid hatched, it would only take about 6 months for the entire planet to be covered several feet deep in sea hares. It'd be a very different place if that happened. But it's just one example of the abundance of life underwater here. Really, every inch of surface that you're seeing on the bottom is just covered in life, and much of it are algae, which again produce that oxygen and food for the sea hare. So this sea hare relies on the kelp forest for food. It can camouflage in. These spots look like the sand on the seafloor, and so it has a nice place to live and hide and a plentiful food source. And some of those eggs, of course, they don't all hatch, or we'd be sitting in sea hares right now. Those eggs are food for other animals. So let's bring John in, and we'll keep with our theme of protecting the creatures that we're showing you. And I'm going to float the sea hare back over to him. It's actually very buoyant, neutrally buoyant. It doesn't really weigh anything down here. But I'll bet on land it's probably 5 pounds or so. So, interesting animal to see today. So we've looked at some animals. We've looked at some threats. And I'm going to just interrupt my train of thought because, Julian, This is one of those days. It's a live program, and we never know what we're going to see. But look at this. I think you guys know what this is. We'll give it just a second to acclimate. And I'm holding a shark. Now, how many of you, I can't see you, but we'll go with a guess. Raise your hand and shout out if you would like to go diving or swimming in shark-infested waters. 3, how about here on the island? Because everybody up there has a chance to do this.
We have 2 snorkelers.
Okay. So, do you want to reconsider snorkeling now knowing that there are sharks down here? Probably not. And junior guards, I know you guys are not afraid of these animals. This is actually a bottom-feeding scavenger and hunter. It eats crustaceans and small fish, shellfish, and you can see its mouth right on the bottom. And it's, again, a very docile animal to us, but sharks are threatened by people. This is a horn shark. You can see a horn right here, one on the back where it gets its name. And every year, millions of sharks are hunted by people, sometimes just for their fins. Yet they're top predators in the food chain, and thus very important to maintain the balance of life here. And so this animal will hide during the day usually. You can see it's very well camouflaged with its spotted markings and the sand-like color. And it will come out at night to feed. But if these were all hunted out, the whole food web could potentially fall apart down here. And so I think sharks have much more to fear from people than people do from sharks. There's hardly ever a shark attack, especially out here. So I'm going to actually call in Julian because we're going to also put this shark back in its sleeping place. There we go. And so today we've discussed some of the threats of the kelp forest, but I don't want to make this a negative story because we are in this beautiful, lush, thriving, healthy environment. And even though there are some threats like we've mentioned, unsustainable fishing, pollution, climate change is also another threat. If these waters warm too much, or if the chemistry here changes, the oceans are becoming more acidic as the levels of carbon dioxide increase on the planet. That can affect things like shellfish, warmer water. All the kelp Josh is showing you really thrives in cold, nutrient-rich water and won't be able to survive if the waters get very warm. In fact, this summer, when we did have a warming of the waters through the El Nino event, most of this kelp disappeared. This is all grown back. Since the water's cooled again, it can grow up to 2 feet a day, and so the area has regenerated. And that's one of the reasons why marine reserves are very important for the health of the kelp forest. By having this more balanced ecosystem, and we have seen a lot of animals today, and some very big ones too, this kelp forest is more resilient to changes that occur, like that El Nino event, or if there is climate change, or unfortunately if there were to be an oil spill or some pollution out here. A marine reserve is a more resilient ecosystem because, again, it is more naturally functioning. And so look at this area we're in. Several months ago, there was barely any kelp to be seen here, and all of the animals that we've seen need the kelp in order to survive and have a place to live and to have that functioning food web. And so I'll leave you with a last thought about that. Talked a couple of times today about how all of this algae down here produces over half of the oxygen in the air we breathe. So everybody take a deep breath and exhale and know that healthy oceans mean a healthy planet. And so I encourage all of you to do what you can to help protect the oceans. Junior guards, I know you guys love the ocean, so go out and play in it now. And for those of you on the island, enjoy your visit here, and I hope some of you do come swimming here in the Landing Cove. So thank you guys for joining us today, and goodbye from underwater.